When I spoke to my grandmother and I asked her what her biggest regret was, she was very clear. Her exact words were, "My biggest regret is leaving my children behind, especially your mother, because she never forgave me."
Welcome to the Zami Nobla National Organization of Black Lesbians on Aging podcast. We are your sound source for Black lesbian herstory. I'm your host, Angela Denise Davis.
My name's Trey Anthony. I'm a writer, actor, producer, and how I see myself and how I move in the world is that I use my art as a level of activism to tell stories on stage that usually don't get heard and to provide a safe space for women of color especially, but also to give another twist on telling Caribbean-rooted stories as well. That's really important to me, to have some kind of Caribbean element to the work that I do because of my family background.
And you're from where?
I was born in England and I moved to Canada when I was 12, but I was raised by a very strong-willed Jamaican grandmother, so I'm very connected to Jamaican culture. My mother is also a very strong Jamaican woman, and you would never have thought that my grandmother ever left Jamaica. So that's how I was raised. So I totally thought I was in Jamaica with her. So I'm very, very connected to Jamaican culture.
I've had the privilege of seeing two of your plays, The Kink and How Black Mothers Say I Love You. We're going to talk more about each of those plays, but I want to know how you moved from being someone who thought about playwriting, thought about presenting these wonderful works on the stage to actually doing them.
I really did not intend to write. Funny enough, when I was in about grade 6 and I was taking a couple of writing courses, English classes, my teacher at that time, Mr. Bellissimo, I will always remember that, used to always say to me, "You have such great imagination." And he was like, "You're such a great writer." And he really encouraged me. And then I got into grade 12 and I thought about writing again. And I was taking this English class, and I will always remember this, that the English teacher said to me, "You have awful grammar and you write how you speak. You will never be a writer." And that stopped me from writing. And funny enough, now when people come to see my work, one of the things they say is, "I love how all of your characters sound so real. They sound like just everyday people and how we speak," right? It's something that I use to my advantage, but it really affected me for the longest while. After grade 12, I stopped writing and I thought that I would be an actor. And out of necessity, I became a writer because I was getting cast with really stereotypical roles and, crackhead number 1, baby mama number 2. And I will always remember this. I went home one day crying after an audition and I said to my grandma, "They're just giving me just shitty roles. Like, I'm just so fed up." And my grandmother said, "Well, if they're giving you shit, then write your own shit." And that's how it started. And she was just like, "Don't complain, do whatever you want to do." And that's how the kink in my hair came about, because I was just like, I want to see something that speaks to me as a Black woman. It speaks to me as a Black queer woman, as a Black Caribbean woman. And something that I remember when I started writing, I always thought I wanted to see a work where my mother could come to the show, my grandmother could come to the show, my friends who are university educated could come to the show, girls around the way, because I grew up in Rexdale, and the projects would come out and see a show and be like, "Yeah, that's my show." And I wanted it to be accessible to all people. And that was really my biggest motivation out of writing. Like, I was just like, I want to see myself, all of me, on stage.
You are our first guest. So this is history making.
Yes, I love history making. Her story making.
Herstory making,
yes.
Indeed. And one of the things that I tell people when I talk about the podcast is we are creating the content we want to hear. And it really comes from this idea of Audre Lorde. She began writing because she wanted to write what she wanted to read, because she didn't see that. And one of the most exciting things about your plays is really being able to go to the theater and see Black lesbians on the stage.
Yes.
And to see the beautiful complexity of those relationships between mothers and daughters and sisters and friends. What do you think about showing up as a Black lesbian and really bringing all of yourself to the stage in this way?
It's funny. I never had any fear about writing me. I think for me, because when I came out, I had so much issues with my own family and their own homophobia and them turning against me and not speaking to me for many years. I felt I had nothing left to lose because I felt, and that I think it actually was the reverse. I think my family thought that it would then scare me, but it actually made me much more brave and fearless in the sense because I was just like, if I lose the love of my family because I'm showing up the way that I want to in all of my authenticity, then a stranger on the street or somebody in the audience is not going to affect me anymore because I've lost everything. And that's how I felt when I first started writing. I was like, I have nothing to lose. I'm ready at rock bottom. I'm ready the person who my family doesn't want to see or be around or pretend that I don't exist. So now I'm going to just show up in all my damn glory, right? And so for me, that's where I started writing from. I was just like, I'm not going to apologize. I know that's what you're wanting from me, but I'm not going to apologize for being who I am. And I think that is what then people really responded to in my work was just the rawness and the pain and the angst of each character and some of the joy, because I also came from a family where if we didn't speak about issues, hard issues, but what we were able to do was really laugh. So all of my plays are rooted in some place with this comedy undertone that plays throughout. And that's my family. But I also write my family, I write my stories, and I write all of our dysfunction in there. And I write the truth and I write about how I feel. And so for me, when people say that the work is really brave and how did you do it, I feel like I had no choice because it was the only place where I felt that I could show up and not apologize for who I am. This is me. My work has always been very healing to me. And so I write it from this place of sometimes of I need to tell this story. And if the rest of the world wants to jump on board and hear it, then that's really great. But this is what I need to tell. And even with Black mothers, when I first started shopping it around, there was this level of resistance once again with my work of like, oh, nobody wants to hear about a Black lesbian. Nobody wants to hear about a Caribbean woman who's a domestic who comes over and leaves her children. Oh, it's too niche. Nobody wants to hear this. And there's not an audience. And then I was just like, okay, then I'll do it myself. And I think that has been my philosophy all of the time with my work. It's okay. I'll do it myself then.
How has your family responded to your work?
It's funny now. The first time I remember when I told my mother I was writing a play, my mother was like, oh, but I don't know. I never thought you had anything really to say. What are you going to write? And I remember like my mother is just like, I don't see all of that, right? And then when I said I was going to do stand-up, my mother was like, but you've never said anything funny in your life, right? So I had the most supportive parents. And so they were stunned by it. My grandmother's always been a big fan. My grandmother always loved comedy. She always loved stories. And so I think once the success of the Kink happened and we were selling out shows and it got picked up and went commercial and then a TV show, I think that's when my family was like, oh, wow, she's onto something and she's really talented. But I think at first my mother was amused by me and kind of like, okay, this is a nice little hobby. And then the more she started to see the media and the talk and people buzzing, then she got on board. And so now my family is very, very proud of me. They come out and see the work, but one of the things that they say a lot around me, they're like, don't say it in front of Trey because it will end up on stage, right? And that is the truth. My whole family knows that something they say will end up on stage. And when they come, like especially my sister with Black Mother, she was like, oh, that's me. I know that's me. And my mother will laugh at some of the lines because she knows she has said them or my grandmother has said them. And that's what I do. I really take quite well from my own life story. And so, you know, a lot of it is fact mixed with fiction is really where I choose to write from.
So you were a comedian before becoming a playwright.
Yeah. So I started out acting and then I wasn't getting a lot of acting roles. And I did this play, which was someone else's play called Green is the Color of Spring. And a comedian named Tarandella saw me and she was doing stand-up in the show called The Black Nubian Show, which is like a Black comedy circuit. in Toronto. And she said to me, you're really comedic. You got really great comedic timing. And she said, you should do stand up. And I was like, no, I don't think I could do stand up. And she was like, no, you really should do stand up. And she said to me, they pay you $50 a show. And back then, she might as well have said that it was $5 million a show because I was so broke. And I was like, $50 a show. So I was like, where do I go? And I started out doing stand-up. It was once a month at the Black Yuck Yuck show. And I started out doing this character called Carlene the Dancehall Queen. And then I moved from there and started to do just regular stand-up on the stand-up circuit. And
was this in Canada?
This was in Canada, and it was a primarily Black Caribbean audience, and they don't joke. Like, if you ain't funny, they ain't even trying to politely clap, or, you know, they're like booing your ass off stage. So I think it was really a good place and foundation for me to start my work. And that's really how, when I then started to write my plays, I already had a built-in audience because people would come out to see me at Yuck Yucks. And then I started producing my own comedy shows called Platform Entertainment. And I would do stand-up comedy and feature also women of color comics and also sketch comedy. So I started to grow that, and I would do that once a month at the Tim Sims Playhouse, which was connected to Second City. And we started out doing like 70 seats, and we moved from 70 seats to their main stage, which was 300 seats. And then we moved from 300 seats to 500 seats. And that's kind of how I started to build my audience. So some people will be like, oh, I've been following you since you used to be at the Nubian shows. So I've been in this business a minute.
Your plays have so much of who you are.
Yeah.
Did your comedy have that as well? Was there any lesbian content in your comedy?
I didn't come out until later in my career, until even the Kink, I wasn't out. There was a lesbian character, but I wasn't out. I was really scared, especially because at that time when I was building my audience was mainly Black Jamaicans, right? And I always say this to people. People are like, oh, not all Jamaicans are homophobic. I say, oh, okay. Well, I know my audience. I was very scared. I didn't want to push them too much. And I was also getting a lot of feedback from people who were like, it's going to really affect your career if you come out. It was kind of like one of those well-kept secrets where everybody kind of knows I was gay. So it wasn't like I was hiding, like I would still be going out to gay clubs. People saw me, but I wasn't publicly out. And then if people asked me in a newspaper article, I'd be like, you know, my private life is my private life. And I'm an ally. I believe love is love. You know, one of those vague Queen Latifah answers. So I would do that. So it was kind of, but everybody knew. And then it wasn't until I got the Mervish deal, which was the commercial theater deal. I was volunteering, funny enough, at this group called the Black Queer Youth Group. And I was going there to support Black youth and Black queer youth. And I would talk to them and, you know, and I'd be like, oh, you know, nothing's wrong with being gay and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, accept yourself and blah, 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 blah. And I was living with my partner at that time. And then one of the youth said to me, well, if nothing's wrong with being gay, how come you haven't come out? And that really hit me. And I remember then saying, I need to really talk about this and be out, because it was kind of like, if you're saying nothing's wrong, then why are you hiding? And I did an interview, I think probably 2 weeks after that, in the local newspaper, and the newspaper reporter directly asked me the question. And he said, there's been long time rumors around your sexuality and blah, 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 blah. And I said, yeah, I'm gay. I am gay. And that was the first time I publicly came out. I did lose some people. I did lose some audiences, but I also gained a lot. And I think that's when it really started to inform my work. And funny enough, one of the reasons I stopped doing comedy is because, as you know, when you do stand up, a lot of it's based on your life, right? And what you're going through. And there was a part of me that just felt shut down because I could not talk about a huge piece of my life as a gay woman, or talk about my relationships, or talk about how my family's handling my gayness, because I wasn't out. So I said to people, I stopped doing comedy because I didn't really like doing comedy, but it really was too because I was closeted. And I just could not talk about my life on stage fully. So my acts started to get stale as well, you know? So that was another reason why I stopped doing stand-up.
Well, it makes me wonder, what would the presence of a comedian named Trey Anthony on stage now sound like? What would she talk about? What would her humor be? Because you're in such a different place now.
I'm in such a different place. And I definitely would talk about relationships because God knows. Being with women is a whole different ball game. And I got a lot to say. And my mother and my family and how they deal with me. Because you can be out to your family, but then how your family deal with your outness is two different things. And my mother all the time regresses. Like just when I think she's got it, then she says some messed up homophobic thing, right? So I'm just real stupid. And you're like, really? This is what we're doing now? This is what we're doing, Mom?
How has your work and your mother seeing that work affected the way in which you all dialogue and the relationship that you all have?
I think for me and also my mother, it has provided us a space to talk, but also a space for me to be much more forgiving of my mother. I realized for the longest time that I forgot that my mother was someone who had hopes and dreams and who was disappointed in life, who also had me at age 17, who also wasn't mothered properly, who, had very unkind things done to her as a child. And for the longest time, all I could see was my mother and that ideal of who I wanted my mother to be. And I was very jealous of people who had what I thought were ideal mothers. And I was very punishing to my mother. Doing my work has made me be able to just see my mother in a much more kinder light and kind of say she did the best that she could. And I think in forgiving my mother, I also was then able to be much more kinder and softer with myself, because I think also too, I'm very punishing with my own self, right? I'm very punishing in who I think I should be and how I should be and how I should show up. And so I was able to also release that and just say, a lot of times, even when I'm feeling really hard on myself, sometimes I say this to myself: you're doing the best that you can in this situation. That is something that I've applied to my mother in a lot of ways, to be like, she's really doing the best that she can. And that took a lot of therapy. It took a lot of spiritual growth on my side to be like, this isn't a personal attack on you. This is just her dealing with her stuff. This is her using the really limited resources that she has in order to mother. And I think it's also given my mother a chance to talk a lot about her childhood. And that was something, when I was writing Black Mothers, I interviewed her and my grandmother. And I don't know if it was because my grandmother was dying that she felt this need to purge and really speak about her life. And then it also gave my mother permission to talk about her life. And it was conversations that I've never, ever had. It was freeing for all of us, for me to hear how she saw things. And then it also made me see too, even interviewing my sister, my brother, and the idea of memory. And I saw how important memory is. It's how we remember and what important details you remember and what things, because they're so painful, that you forget. And so that was something that I felt for my mother and grandmother, especially when they were telling their versions of the story. Both of them differed so much. And so I had to come somewhere in the middle and say, I don't think either one of them are intentionally lying, but I also think somewhere in the truth may be a bit too painful for them to talk about. And so I then had to come somewhere in the middle and create the story that I wanted, and to be able to be more forgiving and kind to my mother. I find it so amazing sometimes when people tell me how much my mother brags about me and how proud she is of me. And I just have never heard that. Or if I've heard it, it's very quick. And it's, I could count maybe one or two times where my mother's like, I'm proud of you. It's also the same thing around the I love yous, right? And that's why I named the play How Black Mothers Say I Love You, because I know for the longest time, I think maybe in the most recently, maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, my mother has started to say, I love you to us. I think that came out of the birth of my own nephew, who's this little boy who runs around and always is like, Grandma, I love you. Auntie Trey, I love you. And he just expects it. And we have changed as a family because of him and his ability to show love. And now my mother will say it. But even when she says it, I know I sometimes get a little uncomfortable. Or my mother, we're really good about saying I love you when my mother is about to go on the flight, or I'm about to go on the flight. She'll text me and say, safe flight, I love you. But it's not something that we as a family do. We're not a very physical family. We're not a family full of emotions. We don't talk about love. We will show, and especially with my family, we will show love through food. Like my mother, every time she comes to see me, will cook my favorite meals for me. And she'll cook stew peas and rice because she knows it's my favorite. She'll make carrot juice, which she knows is also one of my favorites. She'll make ackee and saltfish. And my mother will feed you with her love, but she would rather cook a whole big meal of love for you instead of saying 3 simple words. So that's the way I think I've learned now to kind of understand how my mother shows her love. And it may not look the same way as Claire Huxtable, you know, and that was something that I had to really learn about her.
I think that's, to me, a crucial point, because I can say the same, and I think so many other people can say the same, is that your mother may not say I love you, but for me, my mother buys me clothes. And it's not necessarily the clothes that I would wear, but, you know, but her thing is, I saw these pair of pants and I thought they'd be great for you. But I know that that's her way of showing love. In the play, How Black Mothers Say I Love You, it was really meaningful to see how the mother really was kind of taken aback by recognizing the fact that her daughters felt that way about her, that she didn't say that she loved them and that she did not, in fact, love them. They actually felt that.
Yes. And I think it was really important for me to come to that conclusion with my own mother and see that she doesn't give love in the way that, I think it's that whole thing about your love language, right? But my mother loves me in her own way. And even there was a part in the play talking about clothing, and this was true story from my own story, where my mother was a single mom working 3 jobs, and I wanted a $300 graduation dress. And I remember specifically, and of course I don't have the hindsight. Back then I was like a 17-year-old spoiled kid, and I demanded that I could not go unless I had this $300 dress that I only wore once, right? But my mother went out and got another job and made it happen. And I always knew that my mother would make it happen. And I didn't have even the level of sensitivity around that or hindsight to like, how is she making this happen for you? That all of you guys are well dressed and in name brand clothing, and you live in this house in a middle class neighborhood, and yet she's a single mom of 3 children. How is she making this happen? And that was something that I've been able now to just have a different level of sensitivity around, and just awe of, this is what she did for you. And I think it was also my mother's own guilt around also leaving me as a child. So she never said no to anything that I wanted material wise. Like she never said, oh, we can't afford it, we can't do this. She was like, okay, her biggest thing was, yeah, I'm working on it. And so that was something that I really now just have this real big admiration for how she provided for her family. I have vivid memories of being in grade 12 and my mother going back to school to get her GED. And this today, it makes me even cry when I think about it, of her trying to get her grade 8s. Oh God. But us doing homework together and it being hard for her. And I never saw that sacrifice that she made, that she wanted to better herself, like she wanted to go and do grade 12 and education was important to her, you know, and I have vivid memories of sitting there helping my mother do homework. And she could have just given up and said, you know, I'm too old. But for her to get that piece of paper meant so much to her, you know. So I just have a different level of just kind of like, she did that. Yeah. You know, with very limited resources. And so it also fuels my work, because I'm always like, the resources you have available to you are like vast in comparison to what my grandmother and mother had. And yet they made shit happen. Yeah. You know, so why are you complaining? This is nothing. Right.
Well, you know, there's some dimension of what you said earlier about time and memory.
Yeah.
And all of that. Because the Trey who was 16 thinking about her mom is very different now than this 40-something Trey reflecting upon how her mom was able to do all that, what she's done. And sometimes distance is a real gift.
Oh, yes. Distance is a big gift. I think maturity is a big gift. I think also for myself, who is now considering motherhood, it makes you wonder and look at how you were mothered or not mothered properly. I think also in that, though, as I am changing and being softer with my mother is also changing and being softer with me. And I think before, when my mother used to call me, I used to be very combative. Like, it would be like I was ready for a fight. So I'm fighting, she's fighting, and it's just, off we go. And who wants to be the most stubborn is going to be. And then I just started to, I think in my own spiritual growth, if I was just like, I'm just going to be kind to her. I'm really going to be kind to this woman. And I remember when my mother used to start, I'd be like, okay, Mom. Okay, that I understand. I can see how you see that. I said, you know what? I'm going to think about that. And she'd be like, what? She didn't know what to do with kindness, right? She really just didn't know what to do with kindness. And then she's like, I'm going to let you go now. And she would just hang up because she was used to, like, she could fight. Mm-hmm. But kindness, she didn't know what to do with. Mm-hmm. And I think I've learned that even in how I now partner with my partner, how I'm in friendships with people, how I'm in relationships with women on all different levels of, if you just approach people with a level of kindness, it doesn't always have to be this fight. Mm-hmm. And before, I used to be very combative too, in my nature of thinking people were out to get me. People didn't want good for me. I got to fight my way for everything. And I started to just be like, it's okay. Mm-hmm. Just be softer and kinder. And that has really helped with my relationship with my mother. And then when I don't agree with her, then there are times I'm like, you know what, Mom, I'm going to let you go. And that is that. I'm going to just let you go. And then I pray on it, and then we come back together. The good thing with my mother is my mother doesn't like people being mad at her. So I can hold a grudge for years, right? I can hold a grudge. Mm-hmm. My mother is a very Aries, like, I think that she doesn't like when people are mad at her, but then she'll call and act like nothing ever happened, mm-hmm. right? You could have had World War II with her, mm-hmm. and she'll call you back 3 days later and be like, hey, how you doing? Right? And you're just like, I know me and you just had World War II, mm-hmm. but she doesn't, and that's also something that I feel as a family, we have to learn to actually deal with the issues and not be like, oh, let's just pick up where we left off,
So if your mother were here today sitting in the chair that you're sitting in, and I were to ask her, tell me about your daughter, Trey Anthony, what do you think she'd say?
I think my mother would say Trey's very sensitive. It's so funny. I didn't realize this until my family said something about, oh, you know how you are, how you're so sensitive. And I was like, what? And they're like, oh, everybody has to walk around on eggshells around you because everything's an issue. And I was like, I had no idea this was my reputation in the family. And then she would say she's very funny mm-hmm. and very entertaining. Mm-hmm. And she's very independent mm-hmm. and strong-willed. And she's the child that I worry the least about. I think that's what my mother would say. And I think she would say I'm the most like her. Mm-hmm. I really think she would say that out of all her kids in a very different way. And so I think that's why we used to trigger each other, because there's a lot of her in me, and this level of tenacity, this level of I can get it done, this level of I know what's best mm-hmm. and don't say shit to me. I got this, right? Mm-hmm. And I got that from my mother, mm-hmm. right? So I think that's why sometimes we used to butt heads. Here's another story, which I thought was quite interesting. My mother had never told me this story. And she told my partner this, and my partner told me what's the story around when I was born at age 17. When my mother was age 17, she put me to her breast to breastfeed me at the hospital. And my grandmother took me away from her and said to my mother, basically like, oh, you're trying to be a woman in here, and wouldn't even allow my mother to breastfeed me. Mm-hmm. And I think that just how crucial that bond then was just broken, right? That was just a crucial, significant moment of, I just think about just the symbolism of my grandmother taking me from my mother's breast mm-hmm. and deciding that she was going to parent. Mm-hmm. And that's how I was raised. Mm-hmm. And so I think that plays out a lot in our family dynamic.
if someone really want to look at relationships between Black mothers and daughters, I would tell them two things. Go read Toni Morrison's Sula, and go see Trey Anthony's play How Black Mothers Say I Love You.
Oh, wow. Angela.
And so we're just excited that the play is running in Atlanta.
Yes.
And there are big and great things ahead for this work of yours. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes.
Or what is your vision for this future? Because a lot of people don't know that you were really like the Black Oprah of Canada. That's how people talk about you. Because the Kink in My Hair was major. And those of us in the States don't understand just really how major that production was. So tell us a little bit about how major that was. But then also tell us about what's next for, in particular, this production of How Black Mothers Say I Love You.
The Kink in My Hair was major in the sense for Black Canadian women is because we never ever saw ourselves. I think the closest we ever came to seeing ourselves was American TV shows and The Cosby Show. And I remember seeing The Cosby Show for the first time when I was like probably about 12 or 13 and going, oh my God, Black people are on TV. And we never had anything but that for many years in Canada. And so even when we went to produce the Kink again, it was knocking on doors and people saying no. And I decided to produce it myself. My grandmother gave me money to buy the sets and all of that kind of thing. And then it went on to become a television show, making me the first Black woman in Canada to have my own series on a primetime network. And the first time to have a Black cast on television in Canada. So I remember even when this happened, there was just such a level of responsibility on my shoulders, and people would stop me in the street and be like, man, we're rooting for you, and go on, Black gal, and and also to see like the Caribbean dialect on TV and on stage. That was something that just had never happened. And so I feel like Canada's Black girl, right? The whole Black community was just like, people used to say to me, I would turn on the TV even if I wasn't there because I wanted you to get the ratings, because I knew as a Black girl, we had to support you, right? So they were like, even if we weren't home, we're like, turn on the TV so Trey could get the ratings, right? So I really loved that I really felt that the community was just like, we're in this with you, and we're so proud of you. And so it was amazing to have that work and to see my work appreciated and to see us, and I think you don't understand how important it is to see yourself, because it actually then makes your life, it validates your life to go, oh, actually I'm here, and I remember even just walking down the street and seeing the billboards and the posters. And I would literally see little Black girls just look up at the poster in awe, because we had never seen anything like this in Canada. Like Black people on the poster, we were just like, what is that? And so that was just so life-changing for so many people in Canada. And so that was really important to me. And I feel that's how Canada and Toronto has this love affair with me. And I have a love affair with them because I put them on the map in that sense. How Black Mothers Say I Love You, very similar story. I thought with the success of the Kink, I could then go to any theater and get it done. And again, they were like, oh, it's too niche. It's too Caribbean. It's too much of a historical piece. It doesn't make sense. There's too much happening. She's a lesbian coming out to her family. That she's also dealing with the separation of her mother. It's too much happening. We can't do this. It's too serious. So I did it myself. And then I was lucky that the audience again showed up, and numbers don't lie. The theaters started to notice, like if you sell out a 10-day run and people are packing your theater, they're going to come knocking. And that's what they did. And so now I've gotten a television development deal for How Black Mothers Say I Love You. I also have the screenplay that I'm writing and working on. And I'm hoping that How Black Mothers Say I Love You will do exactly what the Kink did in another way of very much centering a Black lesbian story as the main storyline in television. I don't think that has been done yet. For me to have now this wonderful way of moving in the world, of being able to have a career that affords me the luxury of being a storyteller. I think if that was given to my grandmother, and I always think about this of who she would have been, because my grandmother loves storytelling. I see how I'm so much her regardless if Black Mothers became this hit or blew up and became this TV series and all of this stuff, I think for me, it's my most important work because I was able to capture her story and write it down and also make her feel that this woman who had less than a grade 3 education, who went across the world and was on a boat for 17 days and showed up in England to signs on the doors that said no cats, no dogs, and no blacks. And she still decided to make a life there and, you know, get up at night and leave her 2 other children and then eventually 6 children at night to go and sweep a train. That was my grandmother's job. And then to sit her down and say, I actually want to record your story because it's important. To me, that's my biggest legacy, that I was able to say to her, your story is important and it's relevant. The biggest thing that I learned from my grandmother was around with the Domestic Scheme Act. I didn't know about the Domestic Scheme Act, which was this act that allowed women from the Caribbean to come over to England and the US and Canada. And my grandmother came from a family of 13, and she was living in this one-room shack with her sisters and brothers in Mandeville. And I didn't know that to be part of the Domestic Scheme Act, to be given the chance and the opportunity to go to England, that you had to be between the ages of 18 to 35 and you had to have no dependents. And I didn't know that a lot of these women lied. And my grandmother was one of them who lied and had to say she didn't have any children to be able to get this opportunity to go on this boat for 17 days to show up in this world, England. Like, just imagine that. You're on this boat sailing for 17 days, going to a place that you know no one. It just made me just imagine that. And then I also thought about these women who then, when their children then showed up, what has to happen to you to shut down that part of you that you have to say, I'm going to leave my children. And then how are you able to get that part that you left behind emotionally? And I think that's what happened to a lot of these women. In order to leave, they had to emotionally shut down a really important part of themselves. And I don't think they were able to find that again. In a lot of the women that I interviewed, a lot of them, the way they talked about leaving, it was so void of emotion. And I was just like, and even when I pushed, I could see that they were just like, I don't want to go there because it was so painful. And so I think that was the lesson that I learned, that my grandmother had to shut down a part of herself emotionally that I don't think she ever recovered from, that she wasn't able then to give love or receive love, because you have to shut that down in order to say goodbye. And that was something that I didn't know, because for me, my grandmother was the person who just showed up, right? And who was, you know, my biggest cheerleader, and who encouraged me to get an education, and who ran a business and did this and did that. But I didn't know much about her childhood.
Do you ever think that your grandmother regretted moving from Jamaica?
When I spoke to my grandmother and I asked her what her biggest regret was, she was very clear. Her exact words were, my biggest regret is leaving my children behind, especially your mother, because she never forgave me.
Did your mother ever know that was your grandmother's last regret?
When I first told my mother, my mother didn't believe me. And then I actually had to show my mother the small little video that I had made of my grandmother. And when my mother saw that, she started to cry. And I can name the times that, and count the times that I've seen my mother cry. So for my mother to cry, I knew it hit her in her heart in a whole different way. And she didn't believe me. She really didn't believe that my grandmother said her biggest regret was leaving her behind.
So maybe she too had this sense of feeling like her mother never loved her. My mother said that time and time again. My mother never loved me, or she didn't love me, or she was cruel to me. And that is true in the sense of I don't want to sugarcoat that my mother had a really hard childhood. My grandmother was not in a place to mother. And I also think there was a lot of undiagnosed mental health. I remember as a child, my grandmother going to bed for days and pulling the cover over her head. And we knew that we had to be quiet in the house. She used to say, the noise hurts my head.
You know, I remember my grandmother getting locked jaw, just talking, and all of a sudden her jaw would lock and she would go to bed again for days, and the house had to be dark. And so I know that there was stuff that I think now I could say was definitely mental health, but we didn't name it or call it that, right? And so I think my mother also was the brunt of a lot of that anger and depression, and being the oldest, she had to take that on, you know? And so, and then my mother also had my uncle, who was the youngest, was also a very sick child. And so my mother had to miss a lot of school, and she talks about it because my grandmother couldn't miss work. And so my mother would miss weeks and weeks on top of weeks because she had to stay home and look after her younger brother, who was a very sickly child. So even in that, when I talk about in the play, there's a character, Chloe, who was sick. A lot of that came from my mother talking about the resentment she had of growing up with a sick sibling in the house, and how that affects the whole entire house when there's a sick child in the house growing up. And that was something that I never ever thought about, of what does that look and feel like for you as a young girl, knowing that you can't go out, you can't date, you can't have friends over, you're missing school, then you're behind in school, people are calling you dumb and stupid, and then you drop out of school and you get pregnant at 17, right? And all of those things happened to my mother.
What is the takeaway you want our listeners to have from this interview today with you?
I think the takeaway that I want people to have is, I think we need to check in with the people that we love and ask them point blank, am I loving you in the way that you want to be loved? Because I think we all have our own versions of how we're loving someone. And usually we love people in the way we want to accept love. And sometimes it's not registering with that person. It's not the way that they want to be loved. And I also think, give people the ability to sometimes change their mind on how they want to be loved that day. And I think that's really important as well. Let people feel important. Ask them a question about themselves, and be willing to hear the answer and to give them the space to tell their story. And so I think the takeaway is to talk to people in your life. I think a lot of times we get very dismissive of our mothers and grandmothers, and they hold so much of our stories and so much of our history. We need to start asking questions and recording them, because if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it.
So many great things are coming from you, and it's so exciting to see the work you're doing. And it's so important that you are showing up as who you are, as a Black lesbian who is unapologetic and unafraid of telling her story. So thank you for sharing your story with us today on the Zami Nobla podcast.
Thank you. I had an amazing time. Thank you so much.
What a wonderful conversation with writer, director, playwright, producer, actor, comedian Trey Anthony. I hope you'll take to heart what she left us with. The idea of being vulnerable and being able to articulate your love to the ones who are special to you, as well as the freedom and power of showing up in the world as authentically as you can. Wow, some great stuff there. Since we last spoke with Trey, she had some really good news to share with me. She is now a Hollywood script writer working for the own Oprah Winfrey Network show called Ambition, created by Jamie Giddens and executive produced by Will Packer from Girls Trip, Oprah Winfrey, and Lionsgate. Way to go, Trey Anthony. We will definitely be seeing more of her work on the small screen and the big stage. Congratulations, Trey Anthony. Be sure to stay tuned to the Zami Nobla podcast, because we have a lot of great episodes planned for you. If you would like to contact us with comments or feedback, feel free to email me at podcast@zaminobla.org. You can also visit our Facebook page to stay informed about current events and upcoming episodes. Thanks again for listening. And remember the power of those 3 little words. I love you. Again, this is Angela Denise Davis, your host. Thanks for listening.
Hey.